Hi, I'm Kay Rasmussen, Interim President for the Economic Development Council for Okaloosa County. Thank you for joining us today. We have a very interesting show for you today that you will be watching on the 6 Pillars Initiative. The 6 Pillars is a strategic planning process, and the EDC and the 4 chambers of Okaloosa County have come together in support of the strategic planning to benefit all of Okaloosa County. We have with us today in our symposium here at the Ramada, Bentina Terry, and she is the chairperson for the Florida Chamber Foundation 6 Pillars Initiative. I hope that the event that you're going to watch will answer questions for you and give you more information about the process that is going now countywide to help sustainable and economic growth within our communities. So please enjoy the show. Thank you for watching.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the 6 pillars. And I thought about, I guess this is the second or third time since I've been on the Florida Chamber Foundation board that I've been to this part of the world to talk about the 6 pillars. And I thought, you know, I'm not sure that I need to go through every single pillar again. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the pillars, but what I hope you leave with today is a sense of what to do next. Because what I sense is there's a little bit of, so what? Why do I want to be a 6-pillar community? What does it mean to be a 6-pillar community? Why do I care about the 6 pillars? And if we can talk about that some, I believe that'll help us figure out what exactly it'll mean for this area to be a 6 pillars community, how you can use that, what it's meant in other communities in Florida to be 6-pillar communities, and how we move forward. But I am going to spend a little bit of time just talking about the 6 pillars, how we ended up with the 6 pillars, why we have it, what it means, who developed it. As everybody's mentioned, and it's on the program, I'm the chair of the Florida Chamber Foundation. And for those of you that don't know what that is, that's the 501c3 nonprofit public policy arm of the Florida Chamber. We do no lobbying, we're 501c3. We do research, sometimes that's sponsored research, sometimes that's research on our own, and we do public policy work. And there are about 50-some people who sit on the board of the Florida Chamber Foundation. There are a couple of people from this part of the world, but they're from all across the state. And I've been on that board now for about 6 years. And the Florida Chamber Foundation used to do something called the new Cornerstone Report. And that's really where they gave Florida a scorecard on how they were doing. They put it out every 10 years. And about the time that I got on the board, we started talking about what in the world do we publish this report for? And you guys know what it's like, right? You put out this report, it tells you how everything is doing, how the state is doing, and then after you have a big press release, that report goes and it sits on a shelf somewhere, and people don't pick it up and they don't read it until 10 years later when you publish the brand new report. And a lot of time and effort and money goes into this report that then essentially means nothing. So what we started talking about was, that's not good enough. That's really not good enough. We really need to help Florida create a framework for how to look at these issues and move forward. And that's the 6 pillars. And the 6 pillars is about the fact that we're at an economic crossroads. You've heard a number of different times that we're the 4th most populous state, soon to be the 3rd, that we've got 5 to 7 more million people moving here to the state of Florida. We, at one time, had newspaper ads that were saying Florida is over. And what we came to conclude is Florida's not over. The Florida we know is over. We've got to do more to move people to the state of Florida and improve our economic conditions. And that's just not recessionary related. We were talking about this before the recession really happened. It just exacerbated it. But we've got to act on the economic crossroads with policy, long-term policy, not just how do we do this today, but how do we do this forever. So this gets a little bit to the why we're here talking to you, why we have 6-pillar communities. Elected officials will change, especially at a state level. We have term limits. They don't stay in office for very long, at least the intent wasn't. A couple of them have now rotated back into other positions. But the reality is the people who come to our communities and stay forever are us. They're the business community. We're the people that send our kids to these schools. We're the people that want our kids to get jobs and return back to these communities. We're the people that want to hire employees to stay here and work. We want to have a place where we can bring people here who want to come and visit us. We're the people that become most invested in our communities. So it's all up to us. We need transparency. We need measures. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit. I'm just going to show you some of the measures that we pulled out for Okaloosa County so you can see what we're talking about. But everybody knows in your business, if you don't measure it, it ain't important. If you don't pay attention to it, if you're not asking yourself the question, if Gulf Power doesn't ask itself how many new connects we got, then we don't really know. And we don't know what our growth is. We don't know what our growth is today, and we certainly won't know what our growth will be in the future. So you have to have transparency. There has to be measures. And you'll hear us talk about the Florida Scorecard, floridascorecard.com, if you want to go look at it. Not right now while I'm speaking, but at some point later. That's where you'll see the metrics. And you actually can take those metrics under the 6 pillar areas and drill down to them for your particular areas. You can get down to a county level. So if you want to know what the housing starts look like in Okaloosa County, you go to the Florida Scorecard. And I will tell you, those aren't numbers that the Florida Chamber Foundation came up with. They're the numbers for the realtors. We just provide a place for you to find all the information that everybody else is creating, a way to compile it so that you can do your search a little easier. You can do comparisons. So you can take Okaloosa County and Walton County and see what the differences are between the two. But you can find that information. But if we're not looking at that information as communities and as community leaders, then we can't possibly know where we want to go. So we've got to have that transparency. And we must align and focus our resources. I'm really proud to stand here today and see that there are 5 chambers that are talking about the Florida Scorecard and being a 6 pillar community. Because it can't just be Destin talking about it. Because when people move here, when you move here, when you bring people here, you may love Destin, you may live in Destin, you may not live in Destin, you may work in Destin, you may live somewhere else. You may have employees that commute all across a 5 or 6 county area. But we've got to all come together in order to do this. We've got to align our resources or else we'll waste them. And we all know that. We get that in business. That's how we run our businesses. We pay attention to make sure that we don't have 2 or 3 departments trying to do the same thing. We make sure that we don't have 5 or 6 accounting departments. We make sure that we only have 1 IT department. We make sure that we have the limited resources we have and we use them most effectively. And that's really what we're talking about. We've got to align and focus our resources. So that's what the 6 pillars is about. Now, I didn't intend to go into each of the 6 pillars because for many of you in the room, this is the 3rd time you've seen me here. And I know you thought, if she talks about those 6 pillars one more time, I'm going to die. But I challenge you to truly go in to the website and dig into what those 6 pillars mean and what they mean for Okaloosa County. But I'm going to talk a little bit in Walton County. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do know in terms of data about this area of the world that we're in. So we know that there are about 187,000 residents that live here. And we know that the jobless rate here at 5.8 actually is better than it is in the rest of the state of Florida. And that's a really good thing. And it's been down over the last few years, 1.3 percentage points. So we know, as someone stood up here and said, that the economy here is getting better. Now, I always say that numbers are a little different than real life people. And when you talk to them, they don't always feel like the economy is getting better. We definitely have a lag in our hearts and in our homes behind what the numbers actually tell us on both sides of that. But the good thing is that we know eventually the people and the way we feel will catch up with the economy that we actually see. We have more college attainment here in this part of the world, in Okaloosa County, than we do in the rest of the state of Florida. And that's really good. And why that's important is for several of the pillars, not just the one that's particularly on education, college attainment levels are increasingly more and more important. So we want to know exactly how many of the people that are here have gone to college. I always say that the numbers that we print, because this is these pull from census numbers, they don't pull military. And so if someone is in particular living on a military base, these census numbers don't actually pull those things. It also doesn't pull people who have the equivalents of college education. Lots of the people that we have are in our military. So I tell you that our numbers are really much better than that in terms of the raw skill set and education that we have here in our area. We also have trade, transportation, and utilities as our largest areas of employment. Now, when I saw that, I went, why isn't that military? Well, it's largest private employers here, so it breaks it out. But most people wouldn't think that trade was the largest area of private employment, trade, transportation, and utilities here for this part of the world. You may have already known that, but I certainly didn't. So that means we've got a resource we've got to learn to use. But if we're not paying attention to the measurements, if we're not looking at the numbers, if we're not comparing them to other parts of the state, other parts of the world, then we have no real way to talk about what it is we need to do going forward. We outperform the rest of the state in high school graduation rates, which is really, really wonderful. It's about 80% in the state of Florida, and it's 87% up here. And that's true across all of Northwest Florida. I think it may get as high as the 90s in Santa Rosa County. That is an excellent number for us to have, and it's an excellent fact for us to have, not just because it allows us to do really good economic development and to be able to tell employers what they need when they get here, but it should inform the decisions we're making at our educational institutions. And it should inform the decisions that we're making in terms of what kind of quality of life we want to provide, what kind of volunteerism opportunities we want to have. It should inform a lot of our decisions. But again, if we don't look at these numbers, we don't realize where we are. We're below the state average. We talked about that. That's another great fact. And seasonally adjusted is still, of course, really, really good. I mean, I recognize that our employment rates look much better in the summertime than they do during other parts of the year. But what we found when we look at the numbers, as most of you know, is they're not that drastically different. And that's very fortunate for us. Most of our people are employed. And here's what we think it will look like in the future. So we should have, Okaloosa County, and we just picked Okaloosa, 191,000 residents by 2020. So we expect to grow by a little less than 4,000 residents by 2020. Does that sound right to y'all? Sounds low to me, right? Yeah. So the question is, what they've essentially done, they being the people who do this, as my husband likes to say, who are they, Bentina? They have us at a very slow growth rate because traditionally and historically, we have grown relatively slow compared to the rest of the country, the rest of Florida. So ask yourself, now that you see what the people who predict think about how we should grow, what the 6 pillars says to you is, you know the number, you know the future number, how do you get there? What's your plan? If it's just 4,000 people, the question you ask yourself is, where do I put them? Where do they live? Where do they go to school? But we're past that question. We know where we're going to put them. We know where they're going to go to school. We know what roads they're going to travel on, I think. But is that the number that we want to see is the question that we should start asking ourselves. And that's what the 6 pillars does. It helps create a framework for you to look at that future cast number and say, either I'm not sure what to do with that number, or I don't like that number. So how do I create a strategic plan that changes that number? By 2030, it says it'll be 200,000. So they're saying we'll have about 13,000 more people between now and 2030. Is that the type of growth we want in this area? It may be. There may be people in the room who are going, those 13,000 people, that's cool. I don't even want 2 or 3 of them. But we need to know that, right? Depending on where they're from and what they're driving. But we do need to look at these numbers, and we need to be able to talk about them, and you need to be able to go somewhere else in the state, at the legislative level, and talk about these numbers in the same framework and language that everybody else is talking about it. And right now, most people are talking in terms of the 6 pillars. So how do we do that? How do we talk about being a 6-pillar community? There's a lot of work that's been done, but how do we really talk about that? Here's your earnings report. Here's what we're making in Okaloosa County and in Florida, the rest of Florida, the average wage. It's predicted that it'll go from $43,000 a year to $52,000 a year. Well, that actually doesn't sound that bad. That's your average wage here. In the state of Florida, it'll go from 43 to 52. So we're actually predicted for the average wage in Okaloosa County, those people who do this, to grow faster, slightly faster than it is in the rest of the state on an average basis. So the types of jobs that those 4,000 people will be taking, because this is by 2020, is what should be better here, or hope to be better here. And this is if we keep up with target inflation. So that's not bad. Can we do that? We get $52,000, we make that happen, make that true? You think so? How? Do we know that? No, right? That's what the 6 pillars are supposed to help us figure out. It's like a panacea, guys. It really is. So how do we achieve our goals? How do we look at the numbers that we have? How do we look at the future that we see? How do we look at the future we want to see? And how do we achieve our goals? And that's what the 6 pillars intended to help us do. It really is not a panacea. It really is just a framework. It's just a way for us to talk in a common language about the things that are important across the state of Florida. It's a way for us to plug into a statewide strategic plan in a language that makes sense. It's a way for us to sit in a room with a bunch of other people who care about the issues that we care about and talk about them looking at the same numbers on the same predictive levels. It's about finding a way to facilitate conversations in a framework that makes sense. It's really not a panacea. It's just about finding a way to frame up something that for many of us seems like a very difficult conversation to figure out how we start. It wasn't intended to impress upon each community, this is the 6 pillars, you will do it this way, you will make sure that you address every single one of these issues whether they are relevant to your community or not. It's not run out of Tallahassee, it's run here. And it's the things that are important to you, it's the area that you want to see, it's the places you want to go, and it just provides a framework for you to figure out how you might get there. And then to be able to talk to other people about that framework. It's about increasing Florida's competitiveness, and that really is about increasing our competitiveness. And it's also about keeping track of our progress. Because what's really, really important is if we decide that those 4,000 people that will come here by 2020 ain't really enough, and I really want to have more than that, where do I go and check that out? How do I find out that information? How do I make sure that we're all looking at the same information? And how do I make sure that the information is true and accurate from an objective source? It's not from a politician. It's from an objective source. And I love politicians, by the way. That was not slight. But how do we make sure that it's an objective source? How do we make sure it's the people that are responsible for pulling that data, not somebody who thought they did an internet Google search and figured out a number? And that's what it's about. It's about a common framework. It's about common metrics. It's about finding a way to give us a strategic plan. So how do you become a 6-pillar community? These are the ones that are already certified. And when I say 6-pillar community, I kind of ask them to go back and pull me, what's the definition? Like, what does it mean to be a 6-pillar community? And they said that it is in process, a county or region that has declared an interest to adopt the 6 pillars with at least one 6-pillar presentation in their area. You've had like 3, to establish leadership provided by the Florida Chamber Enterprise or a member of the Florida Chamber Board of Directors or Trustees. This presentation explains the 6-pillar framework to ensure Florida's economy is comprised of high-wage jobs, global competitiveness, and vibrant communities. You've already taken the first step to be a 6-pillar community. And that you've expressed an interest. You've had me come, you've had Dale come. Dale Brill came, when was that? October, to talk about it. We've talked to the Destin Chamber a couple of times about it, and I think we've been a couple other places to talk about it. So you've expressed your interest in becoming a 6 pillars community. So the next step is to actually have formal adoption. And that means that you formalize and complete a strategic plan with at least a 5-year horizon and you publicly communicate to others that you've adopted the 6 pillars as the basis for that plan. And it isn't like you just say, we have a strategic plan and you put it on the shelf. It's got to be a working plan. It's got to be a real plan. If you look at these 6-pillar communities that we have so far, there are actually a whole lot more. We have about 25 6-pillar communities. They're doing this. They've got a plan, they've adopted it, they're communicating it, they're talking to their people about it. They're making sure that people understand the 6 pillars framework, and that's what I'm here to do today. So how do you do it? You express the community interest, you form your executive committee. This all look familiar, right? Kevin came and talked to you about it. You have your kickoff presentation, you have your foundation briefing, and you have task force member identification and recruitment. And those are the task force members that you just talked about who belong to each of those 6 pillars. So when it comes to phase 1 of the 6 pillars community adoption, what you can do is go, check, we've done that. But there are several more steps. So what comes next? Well, you have to have that strategic plan. It isn't the 6 pillars if you don't adopt a plan. And it isn't because the Florida Chamber Foundation goes, well, everybody's got to adopt a plan. It's because it doesn't mean anything if you don't adopt a plan. It's meaningless. There'll be no place to go after today if you don't adopt a plan. We have to do this, and this is where we are, right? We're at the stage where we've got to do the strategic plan. We've got to go through that process. We've got to edit it. We've got to get it out there. We've got to talk to people about it. We've got to say we have a strategic plan. That's where we are in the 6 pillars framework adoption to being a 6 pillars community. Was that it? No, that's actually not it. Then you have a kickoff presentation. It's like more. You convene all the stakeholders. You got to be talking about it. You got to have some objectives. You got to have buy-in from everybody who's involved in the process. Because you guys know, you've lived in all these communities. You've lived a million other places too. With no buy-in, it doesn't really matter. There'll be no 6 pillars framework adoption if Kevin and Shane sit in a room and come up with a strategic plan and hold a press conference. So it's got to be all of us holding hands together to make sure that we all agree that these are the things we want to work on. These are the goals and objectives that are important to us. This is how often we're going to look at the measurements. This is how we're going to make progress forward. Or else we might as well not do this. We might as well not waste the money. And Gulf Power is going to help pay for it. So I had to speak for a steward of our money. We might as well not waste the money. You might as well not waste the money if you've agreed to be a sponsor for this. If it's going to be Shane and Kevin and it goes and it sits on a shelf. Because we've not utilized the tools that we have. And we've got great minds in this room, and we got to make sure we use those great minds. So we have to have buy-in, and then we got to establish our own next steps. What do we want to do? What do we want to look at? What kind of community we want to be? So we need to set our expectations, or else there's no use in doing this, and assign roles and responsibilities for next steps. And all this is stuff that we all kind of do as a part of our everyday business. But moving this community forward as a 6 pillar community is a part of our everyday business. It's no different than what we do in our businesses. We'd look at objectives and goals. We'd set a plan to get there. We'd check our progress along the way. We'd set up community or committees to make sure that we're getting where we are, or assign it to departments depending on what kind of corporate structure you have. And you'd constantly be checking and see if you were getting there. And you'd constantly be moving the goalpost if you were getting there too soon. And that's what it means to be a 6 pillars community. That's all it means. It really is just a framework so that we all can have the conversation in the same context. But the work it is not really magic. It's what we do every day for those of us that run successful businesses. So we have more of this stuff, and there's a little handout that I can give you, or Kevin, or later on Shane, that talks about all this kind of stuff. You'll notice there's several stages. It talks about buy-in, talks about executive committees, task force, all that stuff that we all know we need to do to make sure we're moving the community forward. We had a conference, the Future of Florida Forum, earlier this year, and I said that I don't really, or maybe it was late last year, I said I could care less if anybody ever remembers that the Florida Chamber Foundation created the 6 pillars. Because I want the 6 pillars to have a life of its own and a legacy. I want us to talk about them like it just makes sense. I want us to understand them as a part of our everyday vernacular. I want the business community and the politicians and the elected community in Tallahassee to feel like it's a framework that's real and they can live with. And if it's not, I prefer that we just killed it. But if it works, let's make it work. Let's make it do the things it can do to help build a better community. Let's let it be that framework. We've also got myregion.org. And they've really gone very far with this. myregion.org, you can see that there are 6 pillar communities in this general, I guess that's Central Florida area. And they've actually produced their own customized scorecard. So if you go to the myscorecard.com, and those of you that have seen the presentation before, you've seen me show the dials. And all the dials do is there's a dial, and that's what, there are dials right here. And each of those dials stands for each one of the 6 pillars. And all it does is tell you about your progress. It doesn't actually tell you whether or not it's good or bad, right? And so what they've done, essentially, for the Central Florida scorecard, is they've got a dial for each one of those 6 pillars. And those are their numbers. If you go on the Florida scorecard one, you'll see the state of Florida's numbers. But they wanted to create a very easy way for them to be able to look at their information for their part of the world in one place. So they had a customized scorecard created for them. So it talks about how they can compare. It talks about how they're doing on some of the more salient information that they want to talk about, they've created a place where they really get to be accountable publicly to everybody else. Anybody who cares can go look on myregion.org and see how they're doing on education, on innovation and economic development. And if you have one too, they can look at yours and they can go back and look at theirs and they can compare them. They can see whether or not they're making progress. And you'll see some of those are in the red, which means they aren't making progress. The transparency, the fact that they're not numbers that Broward County, or not Broward County, that myregion.org put together, but they're numbers that come from other sources, say that if I go and look at that page, that's not what they think about their progress. That's what objective measurements say about their progress. So what are your next steps? You know, I hate to say it, but it does cost money to be a Six Pillars community. And it's not money that goes into the Florida Chamber Foundation's little pot. It's money for your facilitation and for your materials. So you have to recognize that there's got to be a way for these things to be provided. The Florida Chamber Foundation is a 501c3. We help facilitate the process, but the money that you pay is really to help that process happen. So there's funding, and I think Shane's going to talk a little bit more about that. You've got the establish your task force per team. I think when we put this together, we weren't aware that you had moved that far yet, and that's awesome. You've really, in the process, from a process perspective, you're really a long way down the road. I will admit that the hardest part is creating that strategic plan, because it takes real work. It's pull up your sleeves type of work. It's deciding what you want to be next type of work, and looking at the numbers and arguing about the numbers. And it isn't a community that hasn't happened in where you look at those numbers and you think they're right, because you think you know your community better, and you go, that number can't be right. And most of the time when we dig into it, the number is right. Or if it's not quite right, it's a number that we can explain why it looks a little different. Let's take educational attainment here. It's likely off because it doesn't count the military into that. But if you don't ever look at it, you don't ever dig into it, you can't possibly know what it is we need to do better. We need strong commitment from you as members. And it goes back to what I was saying a little bit earlier about the fact that we can't really do this if we rely on anybody else. There isn't anybody else. There's no one standing behind me who's going to make this happen. It's got to be me type thing going on. And so the commitment has to come from each of you.
So thank you for watching the show. I hope that you gained a lot of information about the collaborative partnership that has taken place across Okaloosa County. This is a wonderful avenue for all of us to benefit from as we go forward, not only 5 years, but 10 and 20 years down the road, to help business growth and help us all have jobs and live in a quality community. So keep in mind that March 21st is a all-day strategic planning process. So if you're able to participate in that, your input is critical, because this is a community-wide initiative and we need your involvement. Thank you again for watching this show, and I look forward to talking with you again on future shows for the EDC. You'll be seeing more of me as the EDC moves forward, and we'll also be having our current chairman, Mr. Jim Hield. He will be talking to each of the staff members and telling you a little bit more about who we are, what we're doing, and why we're doing it. So thank you again for joining us today, and if we can ever be of service to you, please feel free to contact the EDC of Okaloosa County.